Good afternoon. My name is John Hogan, and along with my colleagues Raj Chari and Gary Murphy, we wrote the book Regulating Lobbying, A Global Comparison, which was published by Manchester University Press in 2010 and has now been translated into Russian and published by GR Research Consulting Centre in Moscow. I very much hoped to be with you at the GR Congress in Moscow today, but unfortunately the last-minute scheduling difficulties have prevented my attendance. As such, I will just speak with you through this brief video to highlight issues in relation to our research, what led us to conduct this research, and where we see our research going in the future. Around 2000, the Irish political system was racked by a number of scandals in relation to political corruption, politicians receiving what are euphemistically referred to here as brown envelopes from businessmen. And that led to concerns that our political class were being influenced by businessmen and not necessarily serving the interests of the communities that had elected them. And this concern with political corruption led to calls for the introduction of lobbying regulations. So the government of the day, through its Department of the Environment, Heritage and Local Government, put forward offers for grants in relation to this research, and Gary and Raj applied and were successful in getting a grant to conduct research on global lobbying regulations so that the Irish government could understand best practice internationally in this field. I was then taken on board as a research assistant on this project. Once the report was given to the Irish government, Gary, Raj and I decided to push on with the research and to widen the scope as far as possible and to spend as much time as possible investigating issues in relation to transparency, accountability in relation to lobbying regulation internationally. And building upon the report of the government, we've subsequently produced a number of papers, one of which was published in the Political Quarterly in 2007, and this led on then eventually to the research that led to the book Regulating Lobbying, A Global Comparison. In this research, our main drive has been to explore the regulating of lobbying internationally, to examine what regulations are out there, to try to categorise them and quantify them to some extent, and to present different variations upon the same theme. So, for example, we have defined different categories of lobbying regulation: high regulated environments, medium regulated environments, low regulated environments, and most other countries, of course, fall into the category of being no regulated environments or having no regulations. But by being able to categorize states, for example, the United States of America and many of its states have high regulations for lobbying, we can then compare them with the regulations in place in countries like Canada, or in Germany, or in some states in Eastern Europe, and in Australia. And by doing so, we can try to examine what regulations fit in best with different societies. We argue that there is no prescription for lobbying regulations, and that no jurisdiction should think that introducing high lobbying regulations will benefit their society any more than introducing medium or low lobbying regulations. But what we do argue is that each society has to find its own way through this issue that will best suit itself. So, for example, in the United States of America, the state of Washington State has the highest regulations in the world. But then, other American jurisdictions are much lower on the spectrum, and the same applies then across the European continent and Australia. There is no easy solution to this issue of regulating the relationship between businessmen and politicians, but what we do argue is that by putting regulations in place and monitoring the behaviour, we do create an environment that is conducive to transparency and leads to the idea that accountability is not something alien. And we have found that in most jurisdictions where lobbying regulations are in place, both the lobbyists benefit and the politicians benefit. Lobbyists benefit from the fact that their industries seem to be legitimate, the regulations make them open and transparent, and they can even use the register sometimes as an advertising forum. They can point to the register and say, I represent Boeing, or I represent Airbus, or I represent Microsoft, and my client list indicates that I'm a very good lobbyist. So the register then functions almost as an advertising forum for them, in addition to being a forum that legitimizes their behaviour. While at the same time for politicians, it means that they can have confidence that if they do meet business people, and they do interact with them, it will not seem to be something that goes on behind closed doors, but is open, transparent, and accountable. Some societies have decided or have opted not to implement lobbying regulations, and in those countries they would argue that self-regulation of the industry is best. And again, that is a matter for themselves. But as we see in lots of countries, when the issue of self-regulation comes up, the arguments are never very clear about what are the benefits exactly of self-regulation for society at large. Mostly the arguments tend to be focused on the industry itself. I suppose the main issue with lobbying regulation is that it is very old. It has been going on in the United States for almost 150 years. But the international experience is still very new. Countries like Canada only started introducing lobbying regulations about 23, 24 years ago. Australia tried it in the 1980s and then reintroduced regulations very rapidly since about 2005 across all its territories and states. And in Europe, the experience has also been limited to the second half of the 20th century, but mostly since the turn of the 21st century. So it's a very new field that societies are experimenting with, and as a result there's a learning process going on here, and that will continue to go on. And we ourselves, in conducting this research, find that it's an ongoing process too. Every few months a new country has either introduced regulations or is considering introducing regulations, or countries that have regulations already are considering altering them. What we have found up to now, though, is that when a society introduces lobbying regulations, they subsequently review those regulations within a number of years, and normally they make the regulations stronger. It's rarely the case that a society rolls back on regulations. I mean, it has happened in Hungary and it has happened in Australia in the 1990s, but even Australia then reintroduced them, and the new regulations they've introduced since about 2006 have been much stronger than those previously in place. In terms of our own research, we will be pushing on with this and hoping to produce a second edition of the book within the next couple of years. Over the last 2 years, since about late 2009 and throughout 2010, we've been conducting another global survey, and this time we dispatched 12,000 questionnaires across the world and have conducted interviews in North America, Canada, Asia, Australia, trying to find out how those societies in places like Taiwan, in states like Western Australia, in jurisdictions like Hungary and Poland, are dealing with the issue of regulations and how they see those regulations going forward. We have also presented our research, in addition to this conference, at a number of international conferences, and earlier this year I spoke via Skype to the Czech Parliament. So we find that this is an area of growing interest across democratic societies. And we would argue that in the interest of democracy, in the interest of transparency and openness, some form of regulation is important so that citizens can have confidence in the behaviour of both their politicians and their businessmen. And as a result, in a free and open democratic society, there shouldn't be any fears about what lobbying regulation has to offer, as it simply has to offer just another form of openness and accountability. I'll stop there, and I'll just wish you all the best with the conference, and hopefully I will see you sometime soon in the future in Moscow. Bye-bye.